Hi everyone! I hope you're all having a great week. This week I've decided I want to work on an abstract painting using some earthy neutrals. Since I had some leftover Titan Buff on my paint palette, I decided that I would start with a very light wash of that color. After adding my initial light wash of Titan Buff, I then moved on to working with Sepia. And at this point, what I'm starting to do is to work on the area of the painting that will most likely be my focal point. There's no real set plan for this painting, as with most of my paintings, I guess, especially my abstracts and my intuitive paintings. I'm usually just focused on either picking a palette of colors and then letting my intuition guide me in the process. And in this case, that's pretty much what I did. I had colors in mind, and the reason I chose these colors is that I had recently purchased this sepia, and I also had purchased a color called French ochre, and I wanted to work with them a little bit more to experiment with them so that I can get to more familiar with them and see how they work. And so that's basically what I'm doing. So I'm adding some color. I'm going to probably add a little bit more of that Titan Buff, and then I'm going to come in with water, because one of the things I love about watercolors is that they are very flexible and they will move, especially when lots of water is applied to them. I really love to work with lots of water when it comes to working with watercolors, because it is one of our most important allies, I guess, in the whole process. And when you're painting intuitively the way I do, it's important to not be afraid to try different things. And I find that when I'm working with water, it really helps me to be more flexible in my process, because the water is going to be helped in some ways by the way I move my substrate, but it's also going to do what it wants to do, considering all the different environmental factors like the humidity in the air, or if it's very dry, the paper will dry much faster and the paint won't move the same way. So there are all kinds of different factors to consider. But I find adding water to the paper, lots and lots of water, I guess I shouldn't exaggerate. You do want to not go overboard, because if your paper is completely drenched, you won't be able to do a whole lot either. Maybe it's worth trying it just to see. But in this case, you see, I added water, then I picked up my substrate and I moved it around to try and make that paint do its thing. And then I came in with my brush and I started to dab some of the water off by rolling my brush on the paper. And this is picking up some of the paint without picking up all of it. And it's leaving some little marks here and there that I find interesting. I also want to lighten some of the areas where I want to add another color of paint. I'm going to come back in with some French ochre, and I did it. I forgot to turn the recording on when I added the French ochre, so I'm sorry about that. But what I basically just did is added a very light initial wash of it, and now I'm going to come back into this area, add some water, and then I'm going to brighten up those areas where I added the French ochre. Sometimes I tend to struggle with how light watercolors dry, but other times I actually really like the effect, because it can create very muted, very subtle, light backgrounds that I also really like. Now, even though I like this subtle, more wispy background, if you will, I do feel that right now the background itself is lacking interest, and so that's why I'm coming in with some French ochre and nickel azo yellow to try and brighten those areas, because I want some of the painting to really catch your attention, and if the colors stay too muted, that's not going to happen. Oftentimes when I'm creating abstract paintings, I really like to come in after my first couple of layers with some more intense color. And in this case, I do want to brighten up the colors, but I still want to keep the colors in the background relatively soft, even though I am using some brighter pigment. So I'm using more water, and the colors I'm putting in are still light in terms of how much water I have mixed into them, so that there's not going to be as much pigment on my paper. I apologize for the reflection of my overhead light on my substrate. I moved my substrate when I wanted to move the paint on it, and I didn't put it back in the first place, in the place it was originally, and unfortunately I didn't remember to check my setup again. So I did at some point realize this was going on, and you'll see that that will go away, but for now, if I try to reduce the screen too much, you won't be able to see exactly what it is I'm doing. So I'm just going to leave it for now, and just know that at some point soon you won't have that little white light showing in the corner of the screen there. I really like the wispy, almost atmospheric colors in my background, and so I'm going to leave them like this. But I am going to come in with a punch of dark contrast using some neutral tint. I'm using my paintbrush to put some of that neutral tint on my paint palette, but I'm not going to use my brush to put the paint on my paper. Instead, I'm going to use an old plastic card, and I'm going to create some lines. And as soon as I start to add those lines, I'm actually really liking what's happening, because it's that dark neutral tint is helping to make those colors that are in the background pop more. And it's drawing attention to what I want my focal point, to where I want my focal point to be. I'm really liking these lines, but there was, as they say, a method to my madness when I added them using watercolors instead of using something more permanent like ink. Once I'm done adding my lines, I'm going to come in with some water, because the lines are a little bit more rigid than I actually want them to be at this point. And I want to spread some of that neutral tint into the rest of my background. And I'll do this by using my water, but I'll be a little bit more conservative as I'm doing this time around. Once I'm done adding these little spritzes of water, I'll let my paper dry and then I'll come back in with something more permanent, like my India ink. It's funny how accustomed we can get to working with certain tools, and I have a pen that I really consider to be one of my favorite fine tip pens. It's that Pentel Sleechy 0.25 pen, and I absolutely love it. When it came time to me adding some vertical lines, which I wanted to create with this pen, unfortunately I realized that my pen was out of ink, and sadly I did not have another one as a backup. So once I was able to get to Michael's, I tried to find one. Unfortunately, they didn't have it in stock. So I found this pen here, which is called a Sharpie roller. It's not a 0.25 pen, but it does have a metal tip, and it's a 0.5 tip. And so it's not quite as fine as my favorite pen, but it actually is kind of a nice surprise of a discovery that I made. So it's a little bit in between, it's exactly probably in between my fountain pen and my extra fine tip Pentel Sleechy. So I'm happy I made this discovery. This is the pen that I'm talking about right now, and I'm probably gonna use it more often. Like I said, it's a pleasant surprise. It's got a metal tip, and so it works really well on watercolor paper. Now I want to add some elements of white to my painting, and I could use gouache. In fact, I do have gouache and I use it on occasion, but I also have gesso on hand, and gesso is pretty inexpensive. I usually have it in pretty large quantities because it's something I use a lot in my studio. And so I'm just going to come in with some white gesso, and in this case the tip of a chopstick, and I'm going to add some marks. And I decided, instead of using the other end of the chopstick, which was more rounded, that I would use the upper end, which was a little bit more rectangular, but not really strong rectangular angles. So I like that because it sort of goes along with the geometric lines that are in my painting, and I thought it would be a little bit better to add those. But I'm always, you know, experimenting as I'm playing and creating my paintings, and so I'll probably come in with the other tip of the chopstick as well at some point. And you know, it's just kind of going with the flow and trying to see what my intuition guides me to do next. One cool thing about the gesso as it was being applied over those vertical lines that I created, you'll notice that the gesso is semi-transparent, and so you can see those lines underneath, and I actually really like that. In some spots, however, I'll come back in at some point and add a little bit more white over it just to make it more opaque. But I'll leave some of these transparent marks because I like that effect, and it's neat that it happened. The colors in this painting are very earthy, neutral colors, and those golden colors that are in my background are very reminiscent of the same color tone, I guess, of my star gold. So I wasn't sure whether or not I should actually use it, but when it's a question of whether or not to use star gold, in this case, because it's similar to the colors in the background, yet different because it's also iridescent, I decided to use the star gold. So it's not going to be very visible, especially right now when you're not looking at it catching the light. It's very, very similar to the colors in the background, and so it's not very visible. But when it catches the light, it's going to have some contrast with that color in the background, and that I really like. I'm feeling as though some of my marks are a little bit more rigid than I'd like them to be. So I've decided to come in with my fingers and spread some of that paint in a way that's less linear and more free-flowing, I guess. I like the geometric aspects of the painting, but I also love that the background is a little bit more free in the way the paint has been moved on the paper. And so I want to create some of that with my paint. My intuition is also telling me that at this point the colors are a little bit too neutral and too alike, so I want to add some visual interest by popping in a little bit of that Cobalt, Turquoise, Teal light. I'm sorry, I seem to always get the name of that paint wrong, but it's a very long name. It's a beautiful color though, and I really love to use it in my painting. So I'll add a few little, not really splashes, but little streaks of that color, I guess, in my painting here and there. And already as I'm adding it, I find that it has a very eye-catching and pleasing effect. As I love to experiment and I want to add more white, I thought instead of using more gesso, I'm going to try coming in with some of my white India ink to spread some of that lightness around with my fingers. And what I noticed as I added it is that the ink underneath it just basically muted that ink and turned it into a gray, which was not really the effect I was going for. So now I'm just going right on top of that with my gesso once again. And you know, I showed you the little bottle of gesso that I have there. The gesso that I'm actually using is Liquitex gesso. That little bottle is a tiny sample kit of different gessos and art mediums that I bought many years ago, and I loved the small container, and so I kept it, and now I just refill it with my Liquitex gesso. So you'll notice that I added some of that white with my finger over top the ink, and it was way more opaque than the ink actually was, and it didn't seem to do the same thing that the ink did, and so I like that better. Now I'm just coming in again with my gesso, and I'm making some of those marks with my chopstick again, just going over the same marks that I made, and I'm covering some of those because I want to make them a little bit more opaque, but I will keep some of the other ones because I do like that transparent effect. So I really like what I've created in my painting so far, but I find that the upper left corner of the painting seems to be missing something. And of course, since I love circles, the first thing my intuition told me to do was to add a few circles. I tend to be very playful and experiment a lot when I'm painting, so I paint with my fingers quite a bit. You haven't seen me do it a whole lot with watercolors, but I tend to do it a lot when I'm working with acrylic paints. And so I encourage you to do that as well. But one thing I want to make sure I mention when I, encourage you to try this and to do this is to make sure that you wash your hands as soon as you're done. And I know this may sound like a given. We're probably all going to wash our hands as soon as we're done. Ideally, I guess I'd be working with a latex glove, but my hands get all sweaty and I really don't like wearing them. I don't necessarily have an allergic reaction to them, but I don't like them. So what I do is I still paint with my fingers, but when I'm done applying my paint, I go straight to the washroom and I clean my hands. The reason I mention this is that sometimes the products that we use can, I wouldn't say they can be dangerous. Definitely I wouldn't want to ingest them. They're not edible. So let's just put it out there. I am not encouraging anyone to eat their paint. But even though we're not ingesting them per se, our skin is an important organ in our body, and so we want to make sure that we're being good to it as much as possible. And maybe in that sense I shouldn't paint with my fingers, but I don't think there's any or much harm in doing it, just as long as I make sure I remove those substances from my hands as soon as I can. And maybe in all reality, I could come in after I'm done applying those little streaks of color with another brush that's drier and I could spread the paint. But there's something different that happens when I'm using my fingers. And I guess it sort of reminds me a little bit of being a kid and not really, caring too much about getting dirty or or putting paint on my hands. I like the tactile aspect of painting as well, I guess. And so that's why I enjoy to do it. And with that final edition of Star Gold, I'm ready to pull the tape off and moving for a closer look. This has turned out to be a fun little abstract project. Different than what I'm normally used to creating. I usually love to create with very bright colors, and in this case I was very, dare I say, controlled in my color choices. But it's good to try new things and to see what works for us and what doesn't. I still think I prefer working with much brighter colors, but I do really like the more muted aspects of this painting, and I love that I was able to experiment and play and discover new ways of moving my paint. Thank you again for making the time to join me on this journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and wish you happy creating.